Welcome to What Matters, a podcast that looks inward at unique experiences, upward for divine direction, and outward at God's activity in the world. I'm Michelle Funk, your host. I'm so glad you're here. I want you to subscribe so that you don't miss any of our episodes, and you are in for such a delight today. Such a remarkable conversation, such a great connection. We are just overjoyed to have with Dr. Diana Butler Bass, who is here with us today. Let me tell you just a little bit about her. Diana writes about faith and spirituality, history and culture, about living purposefully, about how we gather together, about a world of compassion, care, and love, about faith and God. And she is going to be a guest at Inspired for Life Conference, which is coming up this weekend. And so we get a double dose, and I can't be more happy with that. So it is with such pleasure and gratitude that we offer just a warm welcome to you, Diana. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing well. Just kind of hanging out here in my home in Northern Virginia, being very glad that the snow went inland and that we only got rain. So
Nice.
the weather
Yes.
has been so great over the last few days. But we've made it through the pandemic, and it's okay. One step at a time this winter.
That's right. Yes, we have winter weather here, but we also have sunshine today. Oh, which is a happy day in February to get a sunny day. So, yeah, good stuff there. Thank you for being part of our conference. Thank you for being part of this podcast. It's just really such a joy. I've been aware of your important and meaningful work over time, and it's just so fun to get this kind of direct connection with you now. So I know everybody's going to just really love to hear from you this weekend about this idea of grace. And so I thank you for helping us with that, helping us just gain a greater understanding of grace. And so, again, just thank you for that. That's coming up. I want everybody to remember that. And then I know that I want us to talk about something very exciting. You have a new book coming out. And so I do want us to be sure to chat about that today. But can we start with a little bit of grace maybe today? What do you say?
Sure. Well, I'm actually really excited to talk to you because, for one, the new book comes out on March 30th, and I haven't had a conversation in public with a podcaster about it yet. So
Nice.
this will be, you're getting the first look. It's the sneak peek, so that's really fun. And to talk about, and I love talking about grace, actually, because it came out, my love for sharing the subject, I mean, partly comes out of the fact that it's just a great topic. It's something amazing Amazing Grace, what can you say? But
Yeah, right.
it's a remarkably rich topic theologically, within the Christian tradition. And so for many years, I was a college professor, and I remember whenever we got to the unit on the Protestant Reformation, to be able to share with rooms full of students this idea of grace alone and faith alone, was a really sort of powerful time in teaching. My field is church history. So I would be with a whole room full of 18-year-olds, and I've mostly taught at Christian colleges. So they came from church backgrounds, and many of them were very serious, about their faith. So they'd heard all this, but I can remember standing up and talking about Luther's, insights, and how he suddenly realized that it wasn't ever about works, that grace was free, God's free gift of salvation, to all who would have faith. And so I would share that with students. And I can remember in rooms full of these young adults, them just looking at me like, what? You don't have to work for it. And it was fascinating to me, because we always are trying to, we say we believe in grace, we say we believe in free gifts, but we're always trying to turn things into something we can do. We really cannot imagine, we can't fathom especially I think in the United States, when we live in this capitalist system that believes that there's no thing that is ever given to us for free, that everything has strings attached. That's our culture.
Yeah.
And so to stand in a room of 18-year-olds and try to explain this theologically, it was a kind of baffling to them and somewhat surprising, that it's something literally that God does out of God's love, period, full stop, end. There's nothing you can do to earn it. There's no obligation you ever have to return it. It literally is a free gift. And to do that for years, and to teach it, gave me a real passion for what a radical idea it is. And I think that I've carried around pretty much my whole adult life from this experience of teaching church history, just a real deep sort of commitment to the central idea of Protestant theology, certainly. But that is not to exclude my Catholic friends either, because one of the really fascinating and beautiful things about church history is that Luther didn't make up the idea of grace alone. He sometimes gets credited, with it because it spread the idea, and Protestantism has, kind of built its whole vision on that single idea. But many of the renewal movements through Catholic history, particularly different monastic movements and movements of lay people who were committed to lives of poverty or serving the poor, they picked up on this too. And so even though institutional Catholicism had put some pieces around the doctrine of grace that involved, of course, the sacraments and clerical sorts of structures of authority, grace was always there too as a central issue. And some of the most brilliant people in Catholic history knew how to just pull back the too many accretions that sometimes got stuck to the idea of grace in Catholicism, and reminded people of the beauty of this doctrine that I think is really central to the whole life mission and vision of Jesus. So that's part of my passion for it. And it was just great to be able to talk about it. And another part of my passion for the doctrine is tied up more recently in work that I've done around teaching gratitude and grace and gratitude. Karl Barth said they go together like the rain and the thunder. And I think that Karl Barth is just right about that.
Yeah. That's a great statement, the rain and the thunder, because there's a softness to grace, and yet there's such a power to grace. Yeah.
And that they always go together. They are not separate ideas. They're two sides of the same idea. Right. And so I just I've had a lot of fun thinking about it in anticipation of being with you all this Friday.
Yeah. Oh, well, thanks again. Your book, Grateful, has just been, such a wonderful laying out of that connection between gratitude and grace. And it's almost like I'm so afraid to make a mark in this book because it's so good. So I have like all these notes stuck into it. So anyway, if I drop all my notes, I'm in trouble because they'll go out of order. Then I'll go scratching and highlighting. But anyway, we are delighted.
I'm really glad that you have the book there. One of the things that I think that my work tries to do, or I think actually I've succeeded in, it is over the years, the idea of Christian women and how Christian women write, and so here I was, PhD in religious studies and church history. And, I've written all these books about social change and congregational development, all kinds of stuff. And I chose to write a book about gratitude. And I think that the stereotype for women who are Christian writers is that a book on gratitude is going to have a big flower on the cover,
Right. Yeah.
And be kind of a very soft book in terms of the practice of gratitude. And it just kind of appeals strictly to the emotional dimensions of gratitude.
Yeah.
But my work across the board does that. My work is always, I think, very emotive, because I just don't want to limit my sort of my academic work to saying, oh, you can't talk about emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So my work is very emotive, but Grateful is also a very rigorous book. It's about all kinds of, my dog is making noises in the background.
Quite all right.
Hey, Rowan, come here, buddy. But my work is also very sort of rigorous in the sense that I look at the philosophical
Right.
sort of background and the economic dimensions of this word gratitude, and show how it impacts us in terms of how we live our lives in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that book is a really good indication of the kind of way that I approach my work as a woman who is a Christian, who is a thinker, who is a writer.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, you're going to get things that are emotionally rewarding from the work that I do, but you're also going to be challenged. And I hate the stereotype that women only do half of that.
Right.
And so I've worked now for 20 years as a writer to remind people that these two things really draw together in women's work in the church. It is about our intellectual lives and seeing questions and issues from ways that have not traditionally been seen, when those questions and issues have been handled by only particular groups, mostly of ordained men. And it's also about connecting that to the deepest concerns of our hearts. So I hope that one of the things I've done over the last 20 years is just given a very powerful vision of what it means to be a Christian woman writer.
Yes, right, yes. And I think this book is titled Grateful. Your next book, Freeing Jesus. I mean, I don't know the answer to do your books kind of lead one to another? Is it, how do you know? Like what tells you what to pursue next, I guess?
That years ago, I think after I'd written maybe 4 or 5 books, my husband looked at me and he says, honey, you haven't written 5 books. You've written one really long book.
Right.
And that's true. For me. I don't know how other authors do it, but what typically happens is I work on a project, and as I work on it, I'm answering some question. Every one of my books starts with something I'm curious about, a question that I have. And then by the time I get to the end, I've answered that question, to some level of my own satisfaction, at least.
Yeah.
But I find that it opens up some other questions.
Isn't that the truth?
So you can go back and look. I mean, at least I can actually see where the new book arises from the former book. Yeah. And so it's been that way now for 11 books.
Yeah.
So the Jesus book, I think that some people are going to say that it looks like kind of a departure. But I don't really see it that way. I've been very concerned with the fact, we live in this beautiful and amazing and very exciting, I think, religiously pluralistic culture. I'm not one of these people who is afraid of living in a world with a lot of different belief systems and people who look different than me. I think that it's okay. I mean, it's more than okay. It's beautiful, because obviously God has made us in all these different shades of humanity, and that our cultures all have, distinct and amazing voices in the way that we understand goodness and God and what is just. And so to me, the more people and the more voices we put together around a really big table, the bigger the picture is that we have of both humankind and the possibilities that there are for us to live well together in this world, and to heal it and turn it over to our children for a more just future. So that's one of the things I love about pluralism. The more people who are there, the more minds, the more hearts, the more creativity we have in facing our issues and our future. But it does raise questions about how we have also distinctive and different points of view. And so when I was writing about gratitude, one of the things I love about gratitude, and even talking about grace, is that there are theological dimensions of it that are exclusive, but both of those ideas, grace and gratitude, are actually very broadly shared human ideas. And so I was able to write a book that was incredibly inviting, that I've talked about in synagogues and college classrooms and with friends who are Buddhists. And so here I write this very, inclusive book. Now my next book is about Jesus. And frankly, I got a little afraid of that because I didn't want to turn off my friends who aren't Christians. But at the same time, it's really incumbent upon those of us who are Christians is how do we speak about Jesus in this pluralistic environment,
Right.
in ways that are not hurtful or wounding, but ways that are honest and authentic and inviting.
Yes.
And so to move from a very open project towards a project that has at least what is traditionally ascribed as some level of exclusivity in it, talking about Jesus, I think it was just a natural progression for me to move from one to the other.
Yeah.
So they're very connected in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the title, freeing Jesus, rediscovering Jesus as friend, teacher, savior, way, and presence. That's inviting. I mean, I want to believe that in itself sounds like an invitation instead of here's the deal. you gotta think this way, So freeing Jesus, rediscovering Jesus as friend, teacher, savior, way, and presence. Yeah. It's going to be good, isn't it?
I hope so. The few people who have read it have really enjoyed it. And that's always fulfilling to me, especially before it comes out. It's a little like there are some people who have met the baby before the baby's born.
Yeah.
So the book is in process. But, the piece of that puzzle that I was just talking about, I'm in my dining room. So it's like, how do you sit around a table and yet have diversity around that table?
Yeah.
And, I think all the time in theological and spiritual metaphors related to tables. And so, when you sit around a table, you can have a really bad Thanksgiving meal. You can start throwing things at your brother, which I have done in the past. But it doesn't make for the best Thanksgiving. And it also creates all kinds of problems for everybody else at the table if people start throwing food. So, I mean, that's one way of being around the table. You can say, I'm right, everybody else is wrong, shut up and eat the pie.
Right.
And, or you can sit around a table and, I mean, the best tables I ever sit around are tables where people tell their stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's what I think the spiritual architecture of the table is always about. That the table is always that place of hospitality that invites everyone to pull up a chair and sit down, eat, and share their story. Yeah. So that's what this Jesus book is. Mm-hmm. It's not, this is the way that the Bible interprets Jesus, or this is the way Christian theology tells you have to understand Jesus, or if you don't have these right words from the creed about Jesus, you're going to hell. It's not that kind of book. Yeah. Instead, it's a book that pull up a chair and sit down, and this is my Jesus story. What's yours? Yeah. Is really the intent of this book. And if you don't have one, as a matter of fact, one of my friends who read the book, who happens to be he's a UCC pastor, and so he hasn't seen the whole thing yet, but he's seen part of the manuscript, and he said, I don't really have a Jesus story. And I was just like, oh my gosh, you're a UCC pastor, you don't have a Jesus story. And he told me, he said, it's just really been awkward. He said, I do preach about Jesus, and I think about Jesus and justice all the time. And, I care about being a Christian, but I've never experienced what my evangelical friends call a relationship with Jesus.
Ah,
And so I just listened to him,
yeah.
talk about his story. And I wasn't trying to correct his story or say, oh my gosh, how did you get
Mm-hmm.
ordained? Or, it's terrible. But he does have a Jesus story. It's
Mm-hmm.
just not the Jesus story that we've come to sort of frame in American culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's part of my intent, is to have people who even, don't have that language of, I love Jesus or have a relationship with Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of words, that they have Jesus stories too.
Yeah.
And that it's actually an important part, I think, of the whole story.
Right. Yeah. Oh man. So you're in your Cottage newsletter right now. I subscribe to it. I invite everybody to. It's called The Cottage. And you're sharing the bits of the book. And so thank you for being generous to do that, to give a really good sneak peek, if you will. Um, so I admire that, because I don't know what it's like to write a book. And I don't know if you feel like you want to guard it until you kind of have to let it go. But I really have appreciated the fact that you're sharing some of that. And you're right. It seems like to me, I've read a couple, snippets that it's invitational, conversational language in writing rather than prescriptive or defining. So I just commend you for that. I just thought of that. That's so neat that you're willing to share some of the book at this point already. So
But it's fun to have a newsletter like that. I've just really dedicated myself to it during the newsletter, that is, in this last year with the pandemic, because I'm an extrovert and I couldn't figure out, how I was going to talk to people
right.
over this year. And so to have a newsletter is a way of having conversations with people.
Mm-hmm.
And folks do respond to newsletters. I get lots of comments, and people send me back entire notes to me personally. And so I've made lots of friends
Yeah.
through that newsletter. And then I just decided that I wanted to, basically through Lent. I started
Mm-hmm.
2 weeks ago, and so it'll go up until Holy Week.
Right.
On Friday, I've been sending it out. I send it out twice a week, usually on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. There's some social, political issue that I talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And then on Friday, I've been sending out these, 4, 5, 7 paragraphs
Yeah.
of a preview from Jesus. And so it's really interesting to just pick a really small part of a much larger book to
Yeah.
try to say, how can I put this out so that it's meaningful to people and
Mm-hmm.
that it connects to them and that they can read it without necessarily the context of the whole piece.
Yeah.
So that's been fun. I'm glad you've been liking it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you talk about it, the picture anyway on the top of the newsletter. It's an actual building in your backyard. Yes, is that?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's so neat.
The Cottage is an actual place
Uh-huh.
in Butler. And that's the name of the newsletter, and that's where I write.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I really want to share with you and anyone who's listening in the idea of storytelling. I
Yeah.
think we get to this place and we say, okay, yeah, I want to tell my story. Well, how do we tell it? And I've always written with a lot of memoir in my work. I think that alerting readers to where we are as writers is a really important part of putting good work in the world, because that shows people our biases and what we care about, and it also creates a relationship with readers. And so I've always tried to do that. It's not just about my ideas being inflicted upon you, but it's about how, when we read something, we create together some sort of relationship, some sort of community in which we can have a conversation. So that's always my idea of writing books. And so this one was interesting because I knew I wanted to write about Jesus, and I knew I wanted to write about Jesus in this pluralistic context. And how do we talk about Jesus? and the way that I finally wound up constructing the story, and I think this is very important for particularly women who are often interested in writing memoir, or women who seem to be very attracted to that as a genre, um, is I literally thought back and asked myself, what is the first memory I have of Jesus?
Oh.
And what does that show me about the trajectory of my whole story? And so that's what I did. I thought back, and the first memory that I have of Jesus, it doesn't actually show up in the first chapter. It originally did, but it kind of didn't fit actually in the first chapter. It winds up being in the last chapter. And the very first memory that I have is being a toddler, a very little girl. And I know I was probably no more than about 2.5 years old, because the scene in my memory takes place where I'm laying in a big girl bed, and there's a crib in the corner, and my brother is in that crib. And so he was born when I was 2.5. So he must have been very small. So I'm about 2.5, maybe close to 3, no bigger than that. And I was afraid of the dark. And so my mom literally couldn't do anything with me for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and finally fell into this. I don't know where it came from, but she put next to my bed this little tiny glow in the dark plastic manger scene. And it's not something you plug in, but it was, and this would have been the 1960s. So it's not a plug-in nightlight. It's just one of those things that absorbs light during the day, and then at night it glows, yellow. Yeah. And so she put that right next to my bed, and I can remember being tiny and kind of opening my eyes. Instead of darkness, I'd see this little glow in the dark plastic manger scene. I'd see the light, as it were, which is lovely, and a nice theological metaphor. And I could have used that in a lot of ways. But what happened next is the part that I most remember. I could remember waking up one night and screaming. And my mother comes running in. She's expecting, I guess, that I'm screaming because I'm afraid of the dark. And instead of screaming because I was afraid of the dark, I was actually screaming words that were very hard for my mom to decipher. I was going, Jesus teeth, Jesus teeth, Jesus teeth, Jesus teeth. And I can remember my mom looking at me, what are you saying? What are you saying? What are you saying? And what I was saying was Jesus teeth. And what had happened was I loved that manger so much that I had picked it up and I had bitten the head off of the baby Jesus. And Jesus was lodged right here between my two baby teeth.
In your teeth.
In my teeth, Jesus' teeth. And so my mom looks at this, and there's the baby Jesus' head glowing between my teeth. And I use that story in a part of the book where I talk about how God is in our bowels. There's this wonderful prayer in the Episcopal Prayer book that talks about read, learn, and inwardly digest the Word of God. And I had literally taken that seriously before I was 3 years old. And so I liked Jesus so much that I tried to eat him.
That is amazing.
And that's really my first memory of Jesus, trying to eat Jesus, a little plastic manger Jesus. And so it was a really fun book in that sense to write, because I went from that memory, what does that memory say, about the trajectory of the memories of Jesus that would develop over a lifetime. Yeah. And so as I sat down and I constructed the book, I thought, okay, well, this is my first memory of Jesus. Now, how did I understand Jesus when I was really little? What view of Jesus emerges out of a little toddler who will want to eat the baby Jesus's head? And I realized that my first imagining of who Jesus was is Jesus as my friend.
Mm.
And so I go back to that.
Yeah.
And I literally wrote about it in two voices. One of the voices was the voice of a little, 3, 4, 5-year-old girl sitting in Sunday school and hearing these stories for the first time, or singing songs about the friendship of Jesus, remembering what the pictures on the wall of the Sunday school look like, and how potent that idea of Jesus's friend was. And then move into my voice now and talk about how, I don't know, you probably have heard this as well as I have. People think that thinking about Jesus as friend is like shallow or immature. I've literally heard people from the pulpit say, ridicule the idea of Jesus as friend. And instead, we have to know Jesus as, Lord or Master or what have you. That's little kid stuff, Jesus as friend, or say, ridicule Jesus as my boyfriend music,
Yeah.
or my atheist friends sometimes say, oh, I don't need that. Jesus is my friend's, your invisible friend. Jesus is your invisible friend.
Yeah.
And so I go through a lot of that and talk about what the scripture really says about God's friendship. And at the end of the chapter, through various sorts of these two voices interacting with one another, come to the conclusion that if Jesus was my friend, he was the best friend that best invisible friend a 4-year-old girl ever had.
So great.
And so that's what I do then with every part of my life. I take then I move from that first set of memories, Jesus as friend, and said, okay, well, how did I understand Jesus when I was in elementary school? And Jesus as teacher becomes the dominant vision there. And then I just keep moving. And so it winds up being this wonderful, amazing sort of memoir of me, but is also a memoir of Jesus.
Yeah.
And the two come together.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it's my story, the dining room table story. And yet it also invites anybody else sitting around the dining room table. I mean, I hope that everybody who picks up this book, one of the questions they'll ask themselves early on is, what's my first memory of Jesus?
Right. Yeah.
Was it when I was 3?
Yeah.
And that will be for many people who grew up in churches, but I have plenty of friends now who literally never even heard of Jesus, until they were well into adolescence, or never paid much attention to hearing about Jesus until they were in their 20s. And so they have first memories too, and very different ones.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like one of the ways to absorb and kind of interact with your writing is to be around a table with others, and share those stories with one another. Even the fun ones where maybe you've bitten off a chunk of the nativity. So, yeah, I love this. I cannot wait, like I've said, to read this book. So thank you in advance for writing it and inviting us all to take a look at our stories, our own memoirs, if you will, and to kind of flesh out the power of them, I guess. Yes?
Yeah. So often women have had to be prompted to tell our stories. We've been told that our stories are less than, especially around theology. I remember years ago when I was in seminary, and, there we were in the history of theology class, and we were reading all of the big names, Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Wesley, Barth, Bonhoeffer, and go through the whole big list. And I remember very innocently, I went to seminary when I was in my 20s, so I was kind of young when I went to seminary. But I remember asking the professor, who I really admired and who shaped a lot of the way I think about theology early on, I said, well, why don't we read a theology by women? And he literally looked at me and said, well, women don't write theology.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? Because I mean, I knew that there was like Teresa of Avila, you know, and Dorothy Day. And I mean, I kind of had a scattering of some names in my brain. And I said, well, what about these women? And he looked at me and he said, oh, that's not theology, that's memoir.
Wow.
And I'll never forget that conversation. He literally said that men write theology and women write memoir.
Wow.
And so I never forgot that. And through the years, of course, I've taken that on, you know, as a real challenge.
Yeah.
But, you know, he was wrong in two different ways. One is that all those guys, the big name men who we think of as the only voices that really count in theology, if you really know their work, they are actually writing out of memoir.
Yeah.
Because Augustine's Confessions, he talks about his sinfulness. He talks about stealing pears from his neighbor's yard. He talks about his lover that he had for years, whom he never married. It was his concubine, with whom he had an illegitimate son, whom he put away after he became a Christian, and how it broke his heart. And so Augustine's theologies of sin and the world around him emerged out of the life of a guy who wrestled with some pretty bald sins and also a lot of deep pain. I mean, Augustine's a guy with that guilt-ridden conscience. And so it's like, well, wait a second. When he writes then about predestination and freedom of the will further down the road, if you forget about the pears and the concubine, you're going to actually miss a lot of what he thinks about sin and grace. And so, you know, essentially, Augustine is writing memoir. And you can go back and you can literally look at the history of Christianity, and you can see that this is true. You know, Martin Luther, here I stand, I can do no other. Well, wait a second. Here I stand, I can do no other. That looks like memoir to me.
Right. Yeah.
And that becomes a story about grace and faith alone.
Yeah.
And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he writes memoir. He's sitting in a prison with Nazi guards around him while he's writing his books. And so it's wrong to say that the theological voice of the church, shaped over centuries, mostly by men, is not a memoir voice. It is a memoir voice. We just called it theology, but it's their memoir.
Right.
And then when it came to the women, why can't we turn that question around and say what they wrote is, yes, it is memoir, but it is also something much more than that. It is their reflections on God, on the community of faith, and on, you know, the world around them, that is birthed in their memoir, but really is theology. And so in that sense, you know, I think that women's stories have so often been put down or just sort of put in this little side category of memoir, when all along we really have been writing theology.
Theology, yeah.
And that we're now at this point in time when the voices that used to be called, oh, that's just memoir, are moving toward these other voices and saying, well, wait a second, if you're going to say this about grace and faith, you need to say this too.
Yeah.
And so in the Jesus book, I actually do a lot of that. It's amazing how much I talk about sin, definitions of salvation, guilt and goodness, a whole bunch of other questions that emerge very differently from women's experiences than they do in the conventional voices of the church. So I'm writing theology, and guess what? So are you.
Well, it sounds like to me you are taking this on, and you're going to encourage all of us to consider our stories, and because they relate to our faith.
Yep.
absolutely. And help us define it and understand it and interact and live it and share it and all just and stand in it. It's all based on our stories. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I just said, I think is something that everyone who's listening in on our conversation today, I would love them to take to heart, is
Mhm.
that when your story and the story of God come together, that is theology.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to recognize it as such really elevates, I think, the sense of authority that we can bear in theological conversation, but also in the church.
Mm.
And it's not just, of course, women, but it's persons of color, it's disabled persons, it's LGBTQ persons, all of the people whose stories have been just sort of placed in this memoir category, or that's just your experience.
Mhm.
That's almost like a way of patting little kid on the head and saying, when you grow up, you're going to think differently about
Mm.
this. No, those things are the actual texts of theology.
Mm.
And Augustine and Luther and Calvin and Aquinas and
Mhm.
all of the big names in church history, John Wesley, My
Yeah.
Heart is Strangely Warm,
Right.
all of those
Yeah.
big name texts and men, they all knew that. And the
Mhm.
church validated that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we now live in this time when all the stories around this table back
Mhm.
here,
Mhm.
um, all the stories that come from all the different Christian people who are occupying all those chairs, they all become part of a community of making theology. And then when we're sitting at a table with our friends who are Jewish or secular or Buddhist or whatever, um, I think, because of the beauty of the diversity of our own stories, we can listen to the beauty of the diversity of those other stories as well,
Yeah. Yeah.
without having to inflict our stories on others, but instead say, these are our stories. This is how we understand. This is what our experience is. And
Mhm.
then allowing everybody at the table to share their stories.
Mm. Sounds to me like a little heaven on earth right there, you know?
Yeah.
Oh, Diana, thank you. I love talking with you. I love what you're doing. And I'm so grateful that we get to hear more from you this weekend in our conference. And you'll tap in with us live then, too, to interact and share a little bit more. It's just been a joy to talk with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've loved this conference for years. I think y'all do a great job with it, and it's an honor to be here in this community, and to just to be as passionate as I can be about the power of women's voices, not just because we need to be inspired, but we have the capacity to inspire the world and
Yeah,
inspire incredible change in the world.
yeah.
And we really just need to take that power, that sense of who we really are in God, and not be shy of those stories, and the capacity of those stories to heal, to transform, and to really create goodness in a hurting world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm. Thank you. Thank you. That's what matters. Oh my goodness, I don't even know where to go from there. It's just so lovely to have this conversation with you and to hear that encouragement and affirmation. So we're going to take that to heart with us. So I will let us draw to a close here today. Unfortunately, we could go on, but I am so grateful for your time. Diana, I want to thank everybody for watching the What Matters podcast. And I'm Michelle Funk, your host. We'll see you next time. Oh, thank you, Diana. I'm telling you, you just have great wisdom. I love everything that you're doing and want to cheer you on in all you're doing. I get to look over here now. I'm sorry. Thank you for your time. And
Great.